Brian Lyles. Dan, as many know, is the executive director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And Brian is one of the co-hosts here for the KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon Open Source Summit China 2019 keynotes. So he's like introducing people and talking.
Yes.
He talked about some of his favorite projects yesterday, and he's also a senior software engineer at VMware.
Yes, post-Heptio acquisition.
Post-Heptio acquisition. And so I was talking to Brian from that engineering perspective and what makes a community work and what is sustainable about a community. And Dan was talking about it from the organizational point of view in many respects. You see it from, I think, the organizational perspective, but also from the economic perspective, I think. I think you have an interesting point of view about the economics of open source and how that does kind of intersect with community and sustainability. Absolutely. And that's actually what Brian was saying too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can't have one without the other. For our membership, our community, and our contributor base, if I look at our contributors, by and large, they are backed by their employers, right? So they're paid, to do their job, and part of their job is to be a contributor or a full-time committer to Cloud Foundry, and that's just part of the economics. And the output of that is also that the company that is leveraging Cloud Foundry is able to be commercially successful on the platform. So for me, I see economics both in terms of the input in as well as the output.
So how do you sustain that over a long period of time? Cloud Foundry has deep roots compared to other open source projects. It's been around since 2009 or 10 or 8 or 7.
2011, I believe, is when it was created in VMware. Right. We've been an open source software foundation since January of 2015. So we're almost 5 years old as an open source technology. So yeah, we are on the mature end of the hype cycle. And open source projects evolve over time. Early on, there's this immense hype and excitement and enthusiasm. Then the technology matures, the user base matures, and the hype dies down. And so what you're left with is obviously a growing user base, so people that are continuing to use the technology and continuing to expand that use. But there's a lot less hype and there's a lot less enthusiasm about it because it's now a mature technology, and there isn't a lot of exciting things to talk about.
Well, so one of the things that I got today from the keynotes with Linus Torvalds talking about the Linux community, and it's 28 years old.
27, yes.
He's 30 million, I guess it's turning 28 soon.
Yeah.
30 million lines of code, and a community of right now 1,500 people, and then a core committer group of about 100. And one of the things he said was, it's actually his lesson to other open source organizations. I think in particular, he was talking about cloud native organizations. He was saying, don't break the user.
Right. Don't
break the user. And do you find with the model that you guys have that has been developed through the Cloud Foundry Foundation, it builds on that principle? Because if you're having these members involved from that commercial perspective, they're maybe not a higher bar, but there's an economic bar there.
There's both. There's definitely a higher bar, and I think that has been a core vision of Cloud Foundry from day one. We've looked at what other open source projects have done, and we've really learned from, the path they've chosen. And for us, having that stability and that maturity to the platform is important. When you're running Fortune 500 companies or governance around the world on your platform, that needs to be top of mind when you're thinking about how the platform evolves. Is it evolving at a pace that is driving and pushing the innovation leaps, but is also staying stable and mature enough that an organization isn't going to have to really fundamentally rethink how they use that platform as part of an upgrade cycle. And so absolutely don't break the user is first and foremost in the minds of us both at the foundation but also in our community. And it also has influenced the way we accept contributors and committers. And to be a full-time committer, for example, in Cloud Foundry, you have to go through what we call a dojo process. It's a 6-week process where you are deeply embedded with a lot of the teams and learn how they work and learn how the process works and how to work off of backlog. And so that really extends out to how the technology is absorbed and used. Cloud Foundry remains today a very mature technology that everyone that uses it loves it and has really never, knock on wood, there's wood here for those of you listening at home, knock on wood, has never had any major issues as part of an upgrade.
That's interesting. And one of the things that I think about is underneath Cloud Foundry is essentially Bosch, right?
Bosch orchestrates Cloud Foundry for some of the distributions.
For some of the distributions,
right.
Not all of them.
Not all.
But originally it was Bosch, wasn't it?
Well, Bosch was really created and it was modeled off Google's Borg, but Bosch was really created to deploy and run Cloud Foundry. So it is an abstraction that sits underneath it that helps you deploy it out over your infrastructure and manages that infrastructure connective tissue. Let's think about it that way. It isn't core Cloud Foundry.
It's not core Cloud Foundry, but it helps with that resilience in many ways.
It does, because it's what allows Cloud Foundry to give the same developer experience irrespective of the cloud it's running on.
Right.
If it's running on vSphere or OpenStack, or if it's running on AWS or GCP or Azure, from a developer standpoint, it looks the same.
So sustainability and developer experience are definitely at an intersection, aren't they?
Well, absolutely, because if you are investing in the platform as a company, what are you really looking for when you're investing in these cloud native technologies? You're really looking for one thing, that developer velocity, the ability for your developers to create and deploy code to production as often as possible. That's what you're hoping to get from any of these technologies. And for us, being the best platform for developers is really our core vision. And so investing in that and backing that as a community is the best way to make that vision sustainable. And so you're looking at how does a community evolve, how does a technology evolve, and how does the ecosystem around all of that evolve? It all comes back to the experience for the developer.
So how do you treat that vision and that objective when people come into the dojo, when they come into that dojo to get trained? How do you approach the developers to help them understand that vision?
A lot of it is there as part of the process. How do we work? Why do we work that way? How do the teams work that are on the core development team? And keep in mind that those that go through the dojo process are really there to be the core committers. So we have about 3,500 contributors, but about 180 of them are core committers, and those people that are working on it 100% of the time, day in, day out. And those are the people that are accepting pull requests and part of the backlog conversation around what are the priorities of the work that's done. And so not everyone has to go through that to contribute. And so it's a really nice mix of those that have gone through the process and are maintaining the core, but then also the fresh perspectives that come in from the contributor base that have great ideas on everything from security vulnerabilities to better ways of thinking about connective tissue to some of the other emerging projects like the Irene project, for example. And so that's what really allows you to have both that core mature base, but also the evolution around the edges.
Let's use Irene as an example to help us better understand sustainability and how Cloud Foundry approaches it. Tell us about Irene first.
Irene is this little project that allows for, within Cloud Foundry, for there to be a pluggable scheduler. So today, Cloud Foundry, the scheduler that sits in Cloud Foundry today is called Diego. And Diego's been there for several years. And Diego is how Cloud Foundry within inside, quite simply just controls and orchestrates containers and management of the applications. And there has been a lot of conversation around eventually replacing that with Kubernetes. And the challenge has been, going back to sustainability and keeping an eye on don't break the users, is really how do you balance that evolution? Diego is a mature technology. It can run at scale, it can run multi-tenant, it's secure and mature. And so having that, keeping a focus on that has been really important for the Cloud Foundry community, but then also respecting the fact that there's a lot of new cloud native technologies emerging and really figuring out how to balance the needs of what the user are. And so Arini represents the opportunity to have that optionality on your scheduler. I can choose Diego or I can choose Kubernetes and still have that same great user experience.
So when you're introducing these new technologies, how do you make sure you're not going to break the user?
Well, that's largely, thankfully, up to our fantastic contributor and committer base who go through, do the work, put it through test, and then it's gradually accepted into the upstream over time. So Arini, we were excited to say, has passed a lot of the core acceptance testing and is starting to be used in very much a beta way from a lot of our larger distributions with their users and their customers.
A few years ago, you faced, the increasing popularity of Kubernetes. It was just a factor in everyone's, lives really who are in this world, and you made a conscious effort to, think about the Cloud Foundry push environment versus, the Kubernetes environment in many ways. How have you sought to bridge the two over time to keep that, to make Cloud Foundry something sustainable for the long run?
Well, my personal belief is that Cloud Foundry needs to continuously evolve. We're an open source technology, and with any technology, it has to evolve or it just eventually gets stale and dies. And so how do we think about the evolution of Cloud Foundry? What does that mean? Who are we? And that's really where we came back to the core vision of Cloud Foundry, which is the best platform for developers. And as these new emerging cloud native technologies have come up, we've pulled a lot of them in. Projects like projects like Envoy, or the Open Container Initiative, Run C from that, or CNI. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about these new emerging technologies and the role they can play within our platform. And we also thought, how does the platform need to evolve in order to continue to meet those needs and continue to move forward? Mm-hmm. And that's where Arini came from. And we've really tried to balance that, going back to, Linus's great quote, "Don't break the user." We really tried to balance that, the needs of both the community and the user base, but also the need for the technology to continuously evolve.
And so when you look at the China market, where we are, we're in Shanghai, and you've made some, I know you've made visits here and you've spent some time here. What's your perspective on the developer communities here and how they're thinking about sustainability and this idea that you're really talking about, and that premise of, as we were saying with Linus, don't break the user?
Well, I think China is a super interesting market. As you said, I spent a lot of time here last year and this year. It's moving so quickly. So it trailed North America and Europe in the digital transformation initiatives within the enterprise, but it's also moving at such a faster pace that it's such a fascinating mix of moving really quickly, and also trying to do a lot of that innovation and that homegrown innovation that's happening within the country. But they're also, China as a whole is also participating more openly in open source. And so I think it's been a really interesting mix. For those of you that aren't familiar with the China market, it isn't like any other market. It's so different from North America. It's so different from Europe that it's really hard to draw those parallels, because it is just evolving at such a faster pace. And I think the developers in China are doing a mix of doing a ton of innovation and leadership in a lot of new areas, but they're also taking lessons learned that they've seen North America and Europe go through and are improving on them and changing them and morphing them for the culture here in China and for the user base in China. And so I think it's really exciting to watch this evolve, and I think over the next couple of years we're going to see a lot more innovation gains in China.
You have Chinese members then?
I do.
Who are the Chinese members?
A couple of our big ones are Alibaba and Huawei.
Mm-hmm.
Huawei's been a member since the beginning. Alibaba joined a little over a year ago. It's been really exciting to see them, expand their footprint with their customers.
So when you look at, for example, Alibaba, and you compare their adoption of Cloud Foundry and the model with the dojo, compared to North America and Western Europe, are there some differences there?
Yeah, I think open source, I think Chinese companies struggle with their abilities to participate in open source communities at a large scale. Not unlike a lot of enterprises do in North America and Europe. But a lot of Chinese companies struggle because first and foremost, there's a language barrier. A lot of open source, most of open source code and documentation is written in English. And second, there is a workflow difference. In the pace in North America and Europe around open source technologies, pull requests when they're accepted, the pace around all of that is very different than in China, and the expectations are very different. And so I think figuring out how to bridge that is a big challenge. I think it's been really great to see projects like Kubernetes get a ton of headway here in China, much like OpenStack has as well. But it also, I've heard from a lot of Chinese companies that it's really difficult to participate as much as they would like to in open source.
And what are those expectations that are different?
Well, things move faster in China.
Because they have a lot of people.
They have a lot of people, things move faster.
And they work long hours.
They work long
very
hours.
hard.
And so the expectation is if I submit a pull request, a pull request in the U.S. might sit for a couple weeks before it gets accepted in, right? There's a ton of expectation that timeline happens way faster in China. That I submitted a pull request, why isn't it done like now or tomorrow? 2 weeks seems like a long time. And so I think, there's just a little bit of an impedance mismatch between expectations around how pull requests are accepted, the turnaround time, and the availability of people participating in that open source community.
So do you see open source evolving in a different manner than in China versus North America? Are there some different approaches that are changing that are really more oriented toward the workflows and processes of teams and their and their application development?
I think it's starting to evolve. I think I do think ultimately China will participate a lot more in open source, but I also think that they're going to do it in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's what I started saying earlier is you can't really compare China to Europe or North America because it's very different. And I think collectively we're going to have to figure out in open source how to be much more inclusive of a variety of techniques and a variety of approaches to solving problems.
Well, that's an interesting segue then into inclusivity, isn't it?
It is.
And inclusivity can mean a lot of things. Here, our view on inclusivity might be, I think, for me at least, is, and I was saying this to Dan and I was saying this to Brian, that this mobile device has lots of software on it, lots of applications on it, and the people who develop those applications come from a certain point of view, but really it's their job to make sure that when I use it or anyone else use it, that the experience is going to be there.
Yeah.
And so I think the question is about how do you view that kind of the matter of like making sure, for instance, Cloud Foundry remains an organization that makes sure that the end user experience for not just the developers but even beyond the developers is something that is reflective of the overall world that we live in.
Well, I think that comes back to the community, right? Who's in your community? Who's participating? Who are driving the prioritizations of the code and the features that get really pulled in? That having that diverse and inclusive community is important. I think within open source, all communities can get better. I think they're but you made a really good point about your apps on your mobile phone. If you don't have a diverse set of people that are designing and contributing to a technology, then you're not going to meet a lot of people's needs because you're going to basically design for what you know. We all do that. We all have our own approach and our own perspectives. And so if we were given the opportunity to design something, we would design for what we know from our perspective. What are the needs that I have? But my needs are probably very different from your needs. And you expand that across a variety of not just gender and ethnicity, but also socioeconomic backgrounds, and there's a variety of perspectives that can be brought to the table that may be relevant for a technology, but aren't necessarily being considered. I think Cloud Foundry does a good job of that, but I think can always do better. I worry more about it when it comes to things like AI, frankly, artificial intelligence, things that are going to be algorithms that are going to be defining the future of our life. For me, having a broader set of people that are participating in that is immensely more important.
So how are you at Cloud Foundry, making this part of your institution itself?
Well, we try to do a lot of things. We try to encourage diversity, inclusivity as much as we can. We have very strict code of conducts within our community. We have strict code of conducts at our events. Or we have very stringent expectations for how you can participate, because the expectation is everyone should feel welcome. And if everyone is not feeling welcome, then we need to figure out how to change that. And we have a very open dialogue with our community and listen to the feedback they give us, because for us, we need that feedback as well. So how do we continuously evolve as a foundation, as a team, but also as a community in order to meet the changing needs of our community and our user base?
When, let's move to AI. Actually, I want to ask a question about that. So, Cloud Foundry works on that. I think of Cloud Foundry, I think of what you're discussing, I think of CF Push, I think of that experience in itself. What is it that the foundation is starting to think about when, those algorithms do become more predominant, not just in in everyday life, but also kind of in the developer experience itself, and how that then gets, then becomes real and something that we all experience in our world.
Well, yeah. I mean, when we talk about having a platform for developers, it's for developers to write applications that are impacting your life. Everything from a mobile baking app to a application that operationalizes.
I thought you said baking app, and I'm like, I want to get this mobile baking app, like
you could probably do
brownies,
that. Brownies to go.
Brownies on the road,
I think you have to carry on like your little.
It's like those little ovens you'd be able to get.
What were those ovens called?
I forget. Yeah.
Easy Bake.
Yes.
Thank you, Norris. Yes.
Can you imagine a mobile Easy Bake?
A mobile Easy Bake. You just do it your app. You're
it's
like, okay.
Oh, there's my, virtually kind of comes together, right?
I feel like we're onto something right there.
Oh my gosh, venture capitalists, I bet they're listening to this and taking all our ideas.
If you come up with an idea for a startup around a mobile-based Easy Bake oven, you've got my money.
Heard it here first.
Heard it here first, and I will invest.
So when you're so
mobile banking, though.
Yeah, mobile banking,
which more people do have. But those are really, think about a mobile banking app. Everyone has one on their phone, and that's a myriad of applications that sit behind that. Everything from checking your balance to depositing your check to transferring funds to sending money out externally. That's a variety of applications that sit behind that. And those are applications that feed back into a core system. And those are applications that are being developed by developers in these organizations that are changing the way, not just the way that you use the application, but also the way you engage with your bank. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when ATMs first came out.
I am too.
And, and I still think it's magical that you can deposit my check by taking a photo, right? I think it's still magical. And I think to see how far we've come and what our expectations are, and just think about the next 5 to 10 years. What are our expectations going to be then? The amount of visibility and transparency and access we have through just our mobile phone to all of the companies that we intersect with in our personal life, from automotive to banking to insurance to ordering food to paying bills And just think about how that's going to continue to translate. So yes, the developers that are creating all of these apps, even the ones that are AI-based and even not, are changing the way that we work and the way we engage with companies.
So when you're thinking about just the challenges then going forward for open source in terms of its sustainability, what's most pressing on your mind? What is like what is it that you find is the issues and challenges that are going to really define how open source moves forward?
The community around it. I mean, to kind of bring it back full circle, it's the community that's involved and engaged are what drive it forward.
Are you seeing ripples in that? Are there any? I mean, there are organizations that open source organizations that have fallen, and there's some that are not as healthy as others. And I'm curious on your perspectives on those, on the communities themselves, and what are the lessons learned from some of those?
Well, I think every open source project goes through a natural arc. It starts off, there's a ton of hype, and then it glides down. That's not necessarily a negative on the open source project, but it is reflective of the life cycle that open source projects have. It doesn't mean they're not being used, but the technology matures, the hype declines, everyone goes through that. And I think every project has to have that realistic expectation. Now, what happens when it goes down that glide path can last for decades. But recognizing what is the expectation for the community around that, for the ecosystem around that, and for the evolution of the technology that's part of that, and just figuring out how to navigate that. And I think that continues to be a challenge for every open source project.
I know that's a challenge for Kubernetes. It's a challenge for you at the Cloud Foundry Foundation.
Everybody.
OpenStack has seen that challenge. There's a lot of examples of that. Any last thoughts, Abby, before we go?
I am always just happy to be here on the new stack.
Thank you. And we're happy to have you here on the new stack. And are you going to do anything in particular before you go from Shanghai, or are you just ready to go home as soon as you...
Just going home.
Just going home. I think anyone around the world would relate to that. So
it's a glamorous life of business travel, right?
It's a glamorous life. So thank you very much for joining us, Abby. Really appreciate it.
It's not Barcelona, though.
It's not Barcelona, no. All right,
Thank you for having me.
You bet.